already have heard from you earlier in terms of introductions. So very interesting discussion. We just about native apps versus mobile web, where things are heading in 24 months. But I wanted to loop back with kind of the entrepreneurial track record that each of you have with Moxie, and obviously before that. So there's always a learning curve when it comes to starting businesses. So of course things are going to get easier when it comes to your first startup is always your hardest. But there's a lot of infrastructure now that's available to leverage. So what are you seeing, Brian, and from the standpoint of is this, now that you've started Appconomy, is this an easier startup than Moxie, and from your prior track record?
Each of them are different and challenging in their own right. The interesting thing was my first startup, you're right, the experience definitely helps with each successive startup. And am I coming across clear on this mic? Okay, great. So my first startup was in the .com era, which was iMark.com, which was the whole e-commerce revolution in the late 90s, early 2000. And we had this notion of internet time at that time, which we had symbolized in East Austin was a clock that the hands were just spinning around at a rapid pace, and it was called internet time outside of a cafe there. And with the app economy right now, we're finding internet time is like a horse and buggy ride. So things are just moving so much faster. So that's creating an additional challenge. On the flip side is, for us, we have experience having gone through tech cycles before, so you can kind of anticipate and see things a little bit more clearly as these things evolve, because there are a lot of patterns that go from one cycle to the next that are pretty similar. The pace definitely has picked up substantially, and the competitive environment changes substantially too, in that you're right, there are a lot more resources at your disposal. You don't have to build your own server room anymore. You have the cloud to rely on. Development tools are a lot easier to get at. You can release apps faster. It's easier to develop apps. So that creates a speed to market benefit for you for sure, but it also creates competitive challenges in that you have a lot of threats coming from a lot of different directions. In that small micro apps that we talked about are coming out, and they're not necessarily businesses per se, but they do create competitive threats in some shape that we need to factor in. So the calculus gets a little bit more complex, even though it's easier to kind of get to market. As you face more competitors, more apps, more complex ecosystem, but you have the benefit of experience. And given that you have to move faster in this than ever before, then that gives you an advantage, having done it at least once or twice, if not 4 or 5 times.
Steve, what's your point of view? I mean,
I'll add to that. When I really wanted an app was my very first startup, which was a mobile, not phone, hot dog stand. There's a Coney Island stand in Galveston, Texas, in a beach town. And if we had had mobile app then, I mean, who knows what would have happened, right?
So you had a mobile cart.
That's right. The cart was mobile, but there was nothing else that was mobile except the people walking by. But, I reflect, I think things have continued to change dramatically. My history has been, as you know, in building companies over the years. Right out of college in the early 80s, built a first software company. We were out at Comdex. We had a giant booth. It took months to design the plastic casing and packaging to put it on a shelf and get it out in Computerland and Businessland stores, right? And things that today is not even like, what are those? I saw those in a history book, right? And what it took to write the user manuals, get the code, duplicate disks. We had a hard drive that sounded like a jet engine, right? It cost $5,000 and it had 10 megabytes. Right,
yep.
and so I mean things that. Well, we built that company with a few other folks. Ended up selling it to 3Com, the business library, and then started another company, BSG, which over a course of a decade or so grew rapidly to several thousand people. We had 20 offices. It was very complicated to build and roll out, hire the people, manage, deal with hundreds and then thousands of customers, mostly at the enterprise level. Doing anything international was an enormous effort to plan and pull off, let alone expanding from an Austin, Houston, Silicon Valley to an Atlanta, Chicago, New York office, et cetera. But I mean, so the sphere of influence and reach And what it took to scale was so much more complicated, and it moved very fast. We used to hold what we call the quarterly annual meeting. We held an annual meeting every quarter. Brian referred to internet time. That was pre-internet time, and things continue to evolve. So I agree with Brian. It rolls on through after, the whole cycle of taking companies public and going startup on to large scale again. I think today is fundamentally different. So today, it draws on the strengths of two great skill sets. One is you want to have the energy level and drive of a 20-something, if you will, entrepreneur, knows no boundaries, doesn't know what you cannot do, understands that the world is the world, it's global, and it's here all together right now. At the same time, you want to apply the wisdom and perspective, understanding where and how to leverage your market penetration, understand building these business models. Great panel, this past panel on the monetization of business model. How do you make money on something that's being given away for free largely? Do you make it up in volume? Well, I don't think that works. The math doesn't add up, right? But there are ways. So fundamentally, this model, the apps model, is going to challenge all of our collective minds and experiences, and also will tap on those who don't know that those are not boundaries. That's a good thing. So the last point I'll make is that the simultaneous nature of ramping up globally, so even as Appconomy, we've got activity going on in China, multiple places in China, Japan, as well as across North America, and even beginning access into Europe. The company's a very new company. Was conceived of as a global model, and I think these days, take something as simple as Angry Birds, right? Probably the most popular app that's out running around on multiple platforms, right? And that's a global phenomenon, right? So it's a fascinating time, but challenging as well.
Yeah, and historically, in a different era, it would take a while to kind of get to that global stage, and now it's almost right out of the
instantaneous,
right out of the gate. You have to.
And the last one to say is, if you don't think it's instantaneous, then you got your head in the digital sand, because there's going to be 1,000 people at a minimum in one area in Beijing alone. 1,000 people are going to be sitting there figuring out how to do exactly what you think you're doing.
So how do you put up barriers to entry or kind of insulation to? I always look at the Groupon model and it's like, where are the what's preventing someone else from copying this, and where do you see how do you kind of keep ahead in a world where you have that dynamic?
I think where you keep ahead is two things. One is your business model, and again, challenging. So how do you build things that you have at least some levels that you can build in that are harder to duplicate, harder to follow, and harder to make generic. You're not going to prevent it. So it's kind of like stopping a viral attack. How many layers can you put in to begin to mute that, all right? Slow it down. You're not going to stop it. So business model is important. Design of apps, of your IP, and of your product and services that you bring into market. But I think it goes back, it's speed of execution too. Speed of execution is critical, and that velocity and that reach, while you're simultaneously evolving the business model, the apps, if they're apps, and the business is critical. So it's a challenging equation. It is, but that's key.
Yeah, Warren Buffett likes to talk about the castle with a large moat, and your key is expanding your moat, and that's your barriers to entry and your differentiation. And the castle's your product strategy, and your business model, and you want to feed that. So Groupon itself, perfected one thing, and what they had to do was scale rapidly because it was easily replicable. So the sooner they got scale and distribution globally, the better, and then that scale kind of gives them some protective barrier, some moat, right? And Google has similar dynamics going on with their business and the moat they're creating, and Android's part of that strategy, and why it's an open source free system, because it does expand that moat for them. For us, it comes down to global scale and the business model, and then part of the product strategy too. So there are key aspects to our product that we're looking at that we think are fundamental to apps and to how people are going to be using apps at work, in life, and in play. And it cuts across all those boundaries. We had a lot of great discussions today around consumerization of IT, the next wave of the personal computer, and this device here, the iPhone, Android, whatever it is, your mobile device is the most personal device from a technology standpoint, from a computing standpoint you've ever had. It's yours. In many cases before, you've shared your PC, whether it was at work, and it became less likely over time, but certainly at home. This is not shared. This is your device. And it becomes very personal. And so now when you bring it into work, you got to deal with this issue of persona. So we had a discussion of persona and some other personal tools that we've used today as well. And so the persona issue is a big one, because you look at even something as sophisticated as a Facebook, and they still treat you as one person with one identity to all people. And you have multiple identities at work. You interact differently up your chain, up the chain, than you do down the chain, than you do at your peer level. And that's just at work. You have the same set of personas that you vary in your personal life at work and play. And there's this there's a fundamental capability that can get built into mobile-based products that, if it deals with personas well, it can translate to everything, including the truck driver with an app collaborating and sharing competitive intelligence back to a centralized repository of the workforce. And having that ability to allow people to use apps in the way that best suits them for the job, task, and persona at hand can really build, on top of that, you can build a whole bevy of applications for work, life, and play. And that becomes a massive moat around which you can build a variety of different business models that also build barriers to entry. So it's that overall strategy, that really thinking about what is different about this wave, what's different about this device, what's different in how we're using it, how does it apply in our life today, and really baking that into a product strategy and a business model that actually allows you to do that in this market.